Hello and welcome. This is Danielle Dumont at the Freshwater Trust, and we thank you for joining us today on this webinar. Is a water quality trading program right for your facility? So here's a quick agenda of what we're going to cover today. We'll do a short intro to what is water quality trading, and then we'll get into the meat of the program, which is stages of an analysis that a regulated facility can go through when considering water quality trading. We'll follow up with a few examples of some active trading programs, and then we want to leave time at the end for a question and answer session. So for you to ask a question at any time throughout the presentation, I'd like to direct your attention to the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. So anytime you can type in your question there, and then we'll save it and do a Q&A session at the end of the program. Also, this webinar is being recorded, and we will make it available later for review. Now I'd like to introduce today's presenter. Alex Johnson. Alex is the Ecosystem Credit Programs Director here at the Freshwater Trust. Over the past 4 years, Alex has been closely involved in the analysis, development, and implementation of some of the first water quality trading programs in the Pacific Northwest. He's worked directly with private and public entities to help build these natural solutions. Alex brings knowledge of logistics, costing, and contracting necessary to successfully achieve both compliance and watershed restoration. So with that, I'd now like to turn the presentation over to Alex.
Thanks, Danielle. I really appreciate everybody joining us today. Really excited to have such a crop of attendees from all over the United States. So hope this is really valuable, and certainly don't hesitate to contact us after this if you have follow-up questions. Starting with a brief overview of the Freshwater Trust, we are a 501c3 conservation nonprofit that with a 31-year-old history. We're headquartered here in Portland, Oregon. We have about 47 staff now. A lot of those are field staff as we engage in large-scale habitat restoration as well as flow augmentation and have done for decades. We also have 10 staff in the Ecosystem Services Department that really focus on those next two panels, ecosystem accounting and analysis, where we measure the functional outcomes of conservation and restoration actions on a watershed scale, as well as credit program management, where we look at how and where to prioritize ecologically where those actions put in, and the project management necessary to put them in on a schedule that works for Clean Water Act compliance. So that's what's really given us some of the expertise that we hope to share with you today, and we're really looking forward to it. So we wanted to start off, as Danielle said, with just some basics of water quality trading, as there's likely a good diversity of knowledge out there. We're going to focus on point source to non-point source water quality trading programs. A point source is generally a regulated entity under the Clean Water Act and has a pipe that discharges into a waterway of the U.S. Non-point sources is pretty much everyone else. It's agricultural producers, other municipalities that don't have piped effluent, et cetera. And what we've found is that water quality trading can be very beneficial from both a cost standpoint and an ecological standpoint, where point sources are able to work with the non-point source community in their watershed to put the different types of actions on the ground that can really limit the constituents that are going into the waterways. So certainly these programs are not a silver bullet, and they do not make ecological sense everywhere. Oftentimes municipalities or wastewater treatment plants, other dischargers really need to look into specific operational upgrades at their pipe before water quality trading can be an option. But then in many other cases, when you consider the entire watershed ecology, there are a host of different restoration actions that can be much more effective at limiting the different non-toxic pollutants of concern that point sources are now being regulated on. There are quite a few programs out there that have varying levels of success. Certainly here at the Freshwater Trust, we believe that to be successful, water quality trading programs for Clean Water Act compliance must have specific standards that are well known and understood for what projects can generate credits, what those projects need to look like over time. The models that are used for credit measurement are extremely necessary to have broad agreement on by regulators and environmental stakeholders so that those credits are known and can be tracked. And then really transparent systems are very critically important, especially when compliance is on the line, to make sure that a third party has come in and checked off that those quality standards are being met, that the parameters that are used in the models are the correct ones, really that everyone can see that an environmental net benefit is what is coming from this water quality trading program when compared to other types of solutions. This is an example, a pie chart from the temperature TMDL here in the Willamette here in Oregon, where we are certainly most familiar. But we see this replicated in many other TMDLs and other documents describing ecology of our watersheds throughout the nation now. 40 years ago, this may have looked very different, and certainly TMDLs are now looking more and more at the non-toxic pollutants such as temperature, sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen, where a vast majority of those pollutants are coming from those non-point source actors that through hundreds of years of production we've come to the system that we have, but the point sources are still the ones that are being focused on from a regulatory perspective. So it's this situation that really gives the opportunity for a water quality trading program to be effective and certainly more impactful than something at the end of pipe. Some pictures from the field, some of the situations that we've seen. Again, a lot of agricultural producers are small business owners and have certainly their own economics on farm that have precluded them in many cases from putting on some of the more expensive best management practices that can keep the sediment, nitrogen, high temperature water from going back into the watershed. So while the Clean Water Act has been tremendously successful over 40 years, certainly in minimizing those impacts from point sources, the new TMDLs that are being written more holistically for these watershed scale pollutants also can require or need watershed scale solutions. When we're looking at specific actions, just to list off a few, temperature here in the Pacific Northwest, we've started off with riparian restoration, and now flow augmentation can be credited for temperature benefits. Looking at certainly this flood irrigation and some of the non-point sources of phosphorus and nitrogen, we would look to irrigation upgrades, buffer strips, sediment traps, as well as on-farm actions such as cover cropping, no-till, etc. So jumping into really the meat of the presentation as Danielle described it, and it's really, I guess, a response to a lot of questions that I've received in going throughout the region and the nation talking about water quality trading. It's obviously a new solution. It isn't a cooling tower, it isn't a chiller, it isn't a membrane filtration unit, and so there's been a lot of questions that, this seems very complex. How do I even start to think about this? And those are questions from the consulting engineers that we work with or talk with, as well as municipalities in different states and regions. And so I just wanted, that's really going to be the focus of this specific webinar. We're not going to get too deep into the implementation of these programs, but really start on the front end. How do we know if it's right for the watershed? How do we know if it works for the facility? Is the regulatory and policy framework in which that facility exists ready for water quality trading? And when those questions have been answered, how do we construct a program where we know which partners and contractors are doing what to make sure that a facility stays in compliance long term? So starting with, is it right for your watershed and your facility? Certainly, we're a conservation nonprofit. We wouldn't be engaged in this work if we didn't think that water quality trading could have a vastly superior ecological outcome than some end-of-pipe solutions. Not in all cases, but in many cases. But certainly looking at, first looking at some of the localized impacts that may be created by a facility's discharge is something that needs to happen right away. If that discharge is still creating a hot spot in terms of the temperature input, phosphorus, nitrogen input, in that watershed, in those receiving waters, then the facility will need to take care of those localized impacts before they will be allowed to trade. An example of this in Oregon, Oregon DEQ is a big supporter of water quality trading, but has been very specific in the case of temperature that a discharge must not create a thermal barrier for fish passage. It must not directly impact spawning grounds. It must not create instant lethality or any of those issues. Once a facility can check off that they've passed those hurdles, then Oregon DEQ is very supportive of them looking at a water quality trading solution. Then we really need to get into how many reductions are needed. Some of that depends on the risk tolerance of a specific municipality, as well as what is known of the ecology and the discharge for the last 10, 20 years. So working with the municipality to understand what is the worst case scenario, where is there the potential for the temperature or the phosphorus or the nitrogen input from that discharge to be most out of compliance with a wasteload allocation, either a current wasteload allocation or a projected future allocation on the next permit cycle, is really what needs to be figured out. So running multiple scenarios of what those exceedances may look like, really examining what they look like temporally, is part of figuring out how many credits or offsets are needed from a water quality trading program to stay in compliance. Then we turn to the watershed. Obviously, we are looking to make sure that the ecology of the watershed would support a range of prioritized non-point source projects, conservation actions, restoration actions, and are there enough of those actions necessary to generate the benefits needed to keep the facility in compliance. So digging really into the supply chain there, what are the costs of bringing those credits, generating those credits. An example from one of our bigger programs was looking at the riparian restoration needed in the basin. We saw that credits to offset their potential exceedance could be generated from about 10% of the riparian restoration that was needed. That seems like an achievable goal for a water quality trading program in that basin. And then after that is costed out, then it's working with the municipality and their consulting engineer to see like to like what are the costs of some of the compliance solutions that are an engineered solution. Those are often fairly well known by the time we start working with a municipality, be it a cooling tower, a chiller, a filtration system, et cetera, and make sure that we can figure out the value, the cost of those versus the trading program. So again, these are some of the issues that we're seeing in the watershed, certainly out here in the west and even further afield. They may be familiar to the folks on the line. We see plenty of tributaries and even main stem rivers that have very little vegetation on the banks, farming right up to the bank there, and that really creates the challenge of heavy solar inputs, the sun heating up those rivers day in and day out, and that creates the opportunity for riparian vegetation to benefit in terms of temperature. And then in-stream, you'll see in many places aquatic plant life that is really proliferating due to the fertilizer and sediment that's coming in from a range of different agricultural actions. So when you see in-stream plant life, like this picture on the right, that means that native fish are being pushed out of their habitat, and that certainly creates an opportunity to make that better as well. This is an example of an exceedance we've calculated for a facility here in the region, and it's critical to look at not only when is that potential exceedance largest, you see here in the graph in August, but then also when are the credits available to be generated. We saw in this case that in October it was more difficult to generate shade credits than in August, and so the level, or excuse me, the mileage of riparian restoration necessary to cover that exceedance in October was really the driver for this particular permittee. Working with that permittee and to figure out how to develop the language as well to drop into their NPDES permit and to continue to work with their regulator to make this an option is also very necessary. And then again, digging into the uplift potential in the watershed. Uplift in this case is a term that means the difference between current conditions or baseline conditions and future conditions after a restoration or conservation action has been implemented. So we see here from an example down in the Rogue where we are in year 3 of a 10-year implementation schedule for riparian restoration. We see in the top panel there's much more opportunity to restore the riparian buffer than in the bottom panel. That helps us prioritize and see where it's most effective to put in actions that generate credits. Very similar for phosphorus generating actions such as irrigation upgrades, etc. A lot of these are also defined by something like a TMDL that gives some insight into where the point of maximum impact is for the constituent of concern. So anything above where the problem is most acute is what we think of as our service area where we can generate those credits. So working with stakeholders and looking at the regulatory documents like TMDLs to understand where that point is and looking above there to prioritize where those credit generating actions should be done. And I really will have a link further along in this webinar for our uplift report. It goes really in detail on the models we use. There's quite a few of them out there, certainly for edge of field nutrient reductions. We are most familiar with the nutrient tracking tool, although also some of the other ones throughout the nation like SNAP Plus and SWAT models. All of them really look at the agricultural runoff that drains into streams under current agricultural conditions and how we can improve those runoff conditions by applying a host of different management actions on farm. So after restoration, obviously, we're looking at pre-project conditions, post-project conditions, and the difference between the two is the amount of phosphorus or nitrogen or sediment that's kept out of the waterway. Similarly, with solar loading, we use a model out here called Shadolator that runs basically the physics behind how much of that of the sun's heat is reaching the surface area of the water currently, and once we restore a 100-foot tall riparian buffer, how much of that shade is going to be blocked on the day where we have the highest potential to exceed. How much of that is blocked, and that is the credits that we are looking for to generate and then transact over to the regulated entity. And then digging in a little bit more on costing scenarios. As I said, this can get a little bit complex, but there's certainly plenty of entities out there now that can assist consulting engineers and regulated entities to figure out what are the true costs of some of these natural alternatives to versus the end-of-pipe solutions. Oftentimes, because these natural alternatives take a longer period of time to put into place, we work with the regulators to develop a compliance schedule, and then also to figure out what are the logistics, what is the existing supply chain that can help to generate the credits, and what do we need to do to generate a supply chain, or to develop a supply chain that can actually put in these projects on the level that's needed to really generate the credits for Clean Water Act compliance. This table is certainly an example from the Medford program, net present value of the different options that they were looking at. Obviously, they had to make some assumptions on those chiller costs, the storage costs versus the temperature trading costs. With those assumptions made, they were able to compare like to like and decide on a temperature trading solution. And then the compliance portfolio is really what we think of where potentially a water quality trading program can't solve all of the potential issues with an exceedance, and so maybe many actions are needed, or a water quality trading program may fit in really well with a low-cost on-site action, and those all build a compliance portfolio that basically covers a facility throughout the year. So once a municipality has done that feasibility analysis to really understand the ecology of their watershed, what their impacts are, and really see that there is support from an ecological and economic context, that there's support for water quality trading and that it looks to be a cost-effective and ecologically effective solution. Then it's on to looking at the regulatory nexus in more detail and making sure that that it supports trading. The EPA has issued multiple documents. They have a toolkit that we'll share a link to later that supports water quality trading. In turn, many of the regional EPA offices as well as states have developed specific guidance that specifies what types of regulated entities can go into trading for what constituents and what they would need to see. Oftentimes there's still another level of detail that needs to be added, and certainly that is something that it can be driven by a municipality that is very interested in developing a program. It's critically important, obviously, to start collaboration and communication with your regulatory partners, your regulator partners, as well as your environmental stakeholders in your watershed, to make sure that everybody understands why water quality trading can be much more impactful for in-stream conditions, and why you as a regulated entity are interested in looking at this as a compliance solution. And really, as we've noted in certainly the cost schedule as well, oftentimes these natural solutions require a longer compliance schedule. In the case, we've received great support from Oregon DEQ and EPA Region 10 out here in our region that says, we prefer these solutions not only because we think they're more effective, but they have such a host of ancillary benefits. So there are things that we can do within an NPDES permit to develop a compliance schedule to allow that water quality trading program to be done effectively. So just some examples, certainly that we're most familiar with out here of a regulatory framework that has really provided a foundation for active and effective water quality trading. These are both have stemmed from a Conservation Innovations Grant funded program back in 2007 through 2009 that got the stakeholders together to develop what we call the General Crediting Protocol. And just, as some examples to how specific this gets, and it's much more specific than any of the general guidance that is out there. It gives us, as a project developer, the understanding that we need to, in the case of riparian restoration, have a 20-year lease with a riparian landowner. When we implement that project, we must implement at above 1,600 woody stems per acre of native species, and keep that site above 1,600 woody stems, and as well as keep invasive plant cover below 20% for the entire 20-year life of the project. Obviously, these are very specific, site-specific requirements, but it's important for a crediting protocol or a regulatory framework to have that level of specificity. Otherwise, project developers like ourselves, the Freshwater Trust, see that there's a little bit too much ambiguity or confusion for them to want to contract with the municipality to generate these credits. KTAP is the Klamath Tracking and Accounting Program. As you'll see a little bit further on, we're generating phosphorus credits in the Klamath Basin this summer, actually, and we're doing those to the KTAP protocols, which have been developed from those original general crediting protocols to really focus on some of the Klamath-specific issues that are contributing to some of the high phosphorus and sediment loads in Upper Klamath Lake. Certainly an example that I'd really recommend for some of the policy foundations that can support trading. We just completed a convening effort, again CIG funded through a separate CIG grant, Conservation Innovations Grant, really led by the Willamette Partnership again, where we provided some of the policy support and convened the 3 state regulators, Oregon DEQ, Idaho DEQ, as well as the Department of Ecology in Washington, as well as EPA Region 10, to take in a lot of the information that's out there nationally and regionally for best practices for water quality trading. See if we can have some agreement on a regional level on where water quality trading is beneficial, where it is, what quality standards should be followed, what are some of the specific things that need to be agreed upon, etc. So I really recommend looking to that link. It not only has some great discussion of some of the some of the issues, some of the hurdles, but also some of the ways to solve those issues. And there's a great appendix there that has examples from throughout the nation of some of the both successes and some of the other programs that haven't quite gotten off the ground, and how we can continue to learn from those going forward. And certainly digging into that implementation schedule is part of this document, and as well as things like baseline and others. So looking at the stage 3, obviously it can be a long process, but I don't think it's as complex as some folks may think that it is. We see a lot of maturity out there in terms of the entities that understand and want to continue to bring new water quality trading programs online. And so those first 2 stages are really feasibility and policy analyses. They're stepwise processes that can be contracted and really take place fairly quickly. Once those have been done, then there are still some additional questions that need to be answered for a regulated entity to put a water quality trading program into action. So as I said, I'm not going to go too deep into the nuts and bolts of how these programs are implemented, but we think it really is necessary well before the programs are off and running to have a crystal clear understanding of which contracted entities are doing what things, which basin partners are going to assist, and what it's going to look like over the years that a water quality trading program is put out into the field. So, you know, and that really rests with a regulated entity as well as their consulting engineer. Obviously, they oftentimes see the economic benefit of a water quality trading program, but there's still question marks over who does what. So the size and the scope of a trading program really requires a high level of insurance, administrative capacity, legal capacity. We've got a great example here in our own backyard with Clean Water Services, where they are large enough that they've really internalized a lot of the steps necessary to put a temperature trading program on the ground. We work with other municipalities throughout the region here in Oregon, Idaho, Northern California, that are looking to contract out a lot of the services that are going to be needed to put those actions on the ground. So that looks very similar to putting out an RFP for a cooling tower or any other engineered solutions. So looking to certainly some of the past RFPs, like the one we've got linked to right there that the City of Medford put out, is something that a municipality can do and basically draft some specific language to get different contractors to put in proposals for generating the credits on a timeline that is necessary to maintain compliance. So something that we've certainly learned as a project developer in generating credits. As I said at the beginning, we've got 3 decades of traditionally funded restoration, working with granting organizations and large donors to put habitat restoration projects on the ground. But those projects generally don't have the long-term requirements for monitoring, maintenance, landowner payments that is really necessary for a project that is going to generate Clean Water Act credits. So these additional steps in blue are really some of the most critical pieces that we've seen, especially for these riparian vegetation programs that are necessary on top of what is traditionally necessary. So the pre-project data is certainly a lot more than we've ever collected. We've had to develop new systems to track all of the data that we collect, and that really helps us calculate to a really high degree of certainty how many credits are coming from each one of the actions that we're putting on the ground. And then obviously working with a third-party verification entity, for us it's the Willamette Partnership, that checks off that our projects are meeting the standards that have been agreed upon. They're issuing us a certification that the paperwork, the contracts with the landowners, the maintenance plans, etc., is up to snuff, and then registering those on a credit registry to make sure that those credits are serialized, they're not being used by more than one regulated entity at any one time, and then that those projects are monitored and maintained for however long the quality standards point to. So a little graphic that we've worked up on the transaction process, because it is complex, but we think it can also be fairly simple. Obviously, when you think of all of the different things that need to happen to put an engineered solution on the ground, that's quite complex as well. There's multiple subcontractors, there's different sources of concrete and steel and all the different things that need to come into play to put an engineered solution on the ground. Water quality trading programs can look very, very similar. So what we think the critical piece of this transaction process is, especially for a consulting engineer or for a regulated entity, is that that regulated entity shows up at the beginning and at the end of this process. While they can, and certainly there are some great examples where a regulated entity has internalized a lot of these actions, we think it's also very doable for an entity to contract out for credit generation services, agree with a contractor like the Freshwater Trust on what those credits are going to cost and what quality standards those credits are going to be generated by, and then it's on that contracted entity to go out and work with the local restoration partners, watershed councils, soil and water conservation districts, nurseries, heavy equipment operators, and certainly, and probably most importantly, local landowners to site those projects where they're ecologically most beneficial, put them on the ground, conforming to standards, and again, certify that they're done in the correct way, that the paperwork is right, verify that they've been done to those quality standards, register those credits, and then transact those credits back to that regulated entity so that they are valid for Clean Water Act compliance. So fairly quickly, just some screenshots from our active programs. In some places, we're looking at very, very large projects in terms of removing 15-foot tall Himalayan blackberry patches and restoring those with native vegetation. An example ledger, most of our programs are still temperature credits, as that was kind of the first online here in Oregon, but we still think it's critically important to use the other models that have been agreed upon by the regulators, in our case Oregon DEQ, to also calculate the other benefits that come with those same restoration actions. So in the case of this one, it has phosphorus pounds that it reduces, nitrogen as well as sediment, and even though temperature is really the driver, we transact a bundled credit over to the purchaser so that they can communicate to their regulator, to their environmental stakeholders, to certainly their ratepayers, that they're not just purchasing a compliance solution for temperature, but they're also benefiting many other parameters of concern for their watershed. And then looking at certainly the verification and registration steps, we've got a lot of staff in the field at all times, not only looking to make sure that we've got the quality standards right, but also making sure that the models are calibrated and we can continue to refine them. And then on the right, bottom right, is the registry that we use, Market Environmental Registry, if you'd like to check it out. It has great functionality to bundle those credits, as I discussed.
Alex, just real quick before you wind down, Alex, before you wind down and get into a few quick case studies, we'd like to remind everyone that if they do have any questions, to go ahead and type those into the questions box, and then we'll leave time at the end to go through those. So thanks for that.
All right. Really looking forward to seeing your questions. So hopefully, I'm sure that this discussion has kicked up some, so we'd love to answer those in the 15 or 20 minutes at the end. Just looking at some of our programs, we've got two case studies here. Medford, Oregon, I've referenced a couple times. They didn't need a compliance portfolio, which was nice. They were able to generate all of the temperature credits necessary by riparian revegetation in the Rogue Basin. So they have contracted with the Freshwater Trust to develop, to generate the actually 600 million kilocalories. You see there they have a 300 million kilocalorie need. Oregon DEQ and other stakeholders agree that credits need to be generated at a 2-to-1 ratio. So we are generating 600 million kilocalories per day of offsets over the next 10 years. We are about 3 years into that work. We've got almost 300 million kilocalories generated, so we're nearly halfway there and feeling really good about it. There's been tremendous uptick, especially from not only local landowners, but some of our local restoration partners on the ground in the Rogue, the watershed councils, the different conservation entities that love to see this work and want to help connect us with the landowners that have restoration opportunities on their farm. And of course, it's very nice for Medford and certainly the ratepayers of Medford that the miles of native riparian vegetation that they are paying for and that generates these credits, even though we are maintaining those for 20 years, it is still less costly than a giant holding pond, which was their next least cost solution. Obviously, as a conservation organization, we looked very critically at, is this going to be more beneficial? And looking at that holding pond and seeing that it wouldn't even be doing anything for many years where they weren't projected to be out of compliance, we feel that putting those miles of riparian vegetation on the ground is much more impactful for temperature conditions in the Rogue. And then there's all the other benefits of keeping that money in the local economy, paying restoration contractors that are all local for not only implementation and 20 years of maintenance, and then also paying those landowners. Looking at the Klamath, another basin in Oregon where we've got active trading, we're generating phosphorus credits by just contracted a couple months ago with a landowner that owns riparian land in the Sprague River, where his cattle were free to roam into the river and obviously kicking up a lot of sediment and also putting their excrement into the water, to put it politely. All of those things obviously add phosphorus and sediment loads to the upper Klamath Lake, and so we have put in a half-mile of livestock exclusion fencing to generate phosphorus credits for Pacificor. It's really pre-compliance for Pacificor. They operate large hydropower dams in the area, and they know that they have upcoming regulations that are going to be focused on those in-stream phosphorus conditions, and that livestock exclusion credits or credits generated from livestock exclusion are definitely going to be necessary for them going forward. So I've mentioned a couple times throughout this webinar some of the resources. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's a good place to start if you have further questions. We'd love for you to check out our uplift report. It goes really deep into the models that we use. We calculate the functional benefits to water quality of all of the different actions we do each year, whether they are funded by traditional grant and large donors or they are for Clean Water Act compliance. We calculate all those and put them into our uplift report. There's those regional recommendations. We're also part of a national water quality trading alliance that you can see at that link, as well as a national network on water quality trading. Both of those entities obviously have a lot of organizations like ours that can help answer some questions and provide some more insight on how these programs can work and where they're important. And then in a couple weeks, September 27th, my colleagues and I, as well as some of our partners and collaborators throughout the nation, are going to be down in New Orleans at WEFTEC. So if you are going to WEFTEC, we'd love for you to sign up for our workshop, because we're going to have 8 hours of talking about real-life successes, lessons learned, and the path forward for water quality trading. So we'd love to see some of the folks on the line at that workshop as well. All right, so we're on to questions. I'd like to also say, if your question doesn't get answered, my number and my email is right there. I love to talk about this stuff. I'm consistently going to other states. I was just in Colorado, Washington, D.C., et cetera. So there's a good chance that we can be out to talk with you and at least get a phone call together. So please don't hesitate to get in touch. I'd also like to introduce my colleague, David Primozic. He's been at this for over a decade. He's now our Senior Director of Ecosystem Services, and depending on the question, he or I are going to respond with our answers. And so we know that that was very general, and certainly we hope that these questions are going to be able to dig into some of your specific questions, and we really thank you for your attention on this webinar. So are we going to start with me?
Sure.
All right. So one of the first question is where can we find Market Environmental Registry? Just Google is going to be your best friend there. I would just Google Market, M-A-R-K-I-T, Environmental Registry. There should be a link, a button right there that you can look at all the different credits that have been generated for water quality trading, and our credits are all registered under COTE. C-O-T-E, Counting on the Environment, which is the protocols that we have registered them under. So you can search for the Freshwater Trust and some of our partners, and you'll see all of the credits that have been generated and how they track to specific sites and specific actions. Next question up is who maintains legal responsibility for the riparian buffer? Is an entity created that is distinguished from the land? So this is one we get a lot. Certainly folks are very familiar or usually quite familiar with mitigation banking and some of the requirements that sites have conservation easements that run for perpetuity. The requirements out here in Oregon, and certainly that we support, don't go quite into perpetuity because we think that infinity is a really long time and we can get a lot of what we need on the ground for shorter leases. And so the Freshwater Trust, as a project developer, contract a 20-year lease with a landowner, and we have the legal responsibility to keep that site, after it is implemented, to the standards necessary to keep those credits valid. We cannot contract, obviously, with a municipality to take on their Clean Water Act obligations. Those obligations are always held by that discharger. However, as is appropriate in any business contract, we specify what happens if we are not able to keep that site up to standards, and we decide, or we specify with that entity what restitution they may have if through our fault that site is not valid or not generating valid credits. So the Freshwater Trust holds that lease with a landowner, and we again see that that is actually very beneficial because the Freshwater Trust, as an independent nonprofit, is often a lot easier for riparian landowners to contract with. Plenty of rural landowners do not have an interest in contracting with state or local governments, and so inserting a third party such as ourselves into the equation may help to get some of those landowners that otherwise may not want to be involved.
All right, another of the questions, I'll summarize. The question here was related to lease values and time frame. The lease values are established on a site-by-site basis. We typically look at the available information around lease payments for other agricultural activities and conservation actions in the watershed. Clearly, the Natural Resources Conservation Service programs are a pretty large data set that enable us to begin those conversations, but we don't have a set price. I think that every individual landowner is different. The opportunity cost for every individual landowner and the needs of each individual chunk of ground where restoration happens is different. The 20-year time frame, the question is it a national standard? Because we're looking at a riparian areas, we have a 20-year time frame. It's a minimum renewable life, meaning that the credit has a minimum lifespan of 20 years, but that the credit value is renewable so long as the project is maintained and legal custody of the credits exists. And the reason for the 20-year time frame is really driven by the amount of time it takes to grow shade. So the entity, it gets credit and is able to use the credit from the projected shade prior to the actual formation of that shade, and in return, there's a 2-to-1 ratio that is established, and that 2-to-1 ratio covers the time lost from the years that the project won't be generating shade, but in the end of 20 years, you'll have that full shade. So you get twice the shade value at the end of when the plants are maturing. But again, that 20-year time frame is not a national standard. It is a standard that is linked specific to Oregon right now, and it's driven by it's a 20-year minimum renewable life. So.
Pardon me, I was on mute. This is Alex. Is there somewhere central to find relevant state regulatory frameworks, was the question. And sadly there is not. I think that that's something that the Water Quality Trading Network, the national network, is certainly hoping to fix. But as of right now, I think that there are quite a few places in both state DEQ and DNR websites where an entity or a consulting engineer can go to look for state-specific guidance. There's also overarching guidance from EPA where there isn't state guidance. You can look to some of that overarching guidance from EPA that gives some of the best practices. I'd really look to that toolkit for water quality trading. that gives a lot of the different standards that we're talking about, and certainly build a program that matches up with both if you have state guidance that matches up with that, or that overarching EPA guidance. So, and I think a lot of those, again, are summarized really succinctly and well in the Joint Regional Recommendations for Water Quality Trading document. I could just Google search that as well, or look to the link when we send out this webinar. It's on the Willamette Partnerships website, and again, it's the Joint Regional Recommendations on Water Quality Trading.
Yeah, and this is David Primasic again. And one of the questions came in is, what do we see as the largest obstacle for starting water quality trading? And I think that this is obviously, there are multiple parts to this. One of the biggest issues that we see is right now I think there's a perception that water quality trading is a fairly complicated process, and I think that that's not untrue, but when we look at the component parts of a water quality trading program, and we look at the facilities planning processes that a range of utilities are going through to comply with new limits that are showing up in permits, I think that one of the biggest challenges is really getting the facilities and the regulatory agencies to understand how a water quality trading program fits within the larger context of attainment of water quality standards in a watershed. I think that there's as Alex said previously, this is not a silver bullet. There's no one solution here. The range of water quality, the reductions that are likely to occur from a water quality trading program certainly don't make up the bulk of the reductions that are needed in a watershed. And so being fairly careful and methodical about articulating the way a trading program at an individual's facility fits within a larger watershed plan is one of the biggest obstacles. And I think that when you start cutting through the layers there's some regulatory concerns, but really what we're seeing is that in some of the ways it's a capacity concern issue as well. Is there the expertise available to help determine whether or not a water quality trading program is feasible? And once we can get in, and I think that what Alex has tried to show you today is there's a fairly simple process that if we follow those process steps and can determine that a water quality trading program is not only better for the environment but is feasible for the facility, then those meaningful discussions can happen at a facility by facility basis. I think one of the other challenges has to do with standards. I think that folks spend a lot of time trying to determine what counts, what doesn't count. But those are what the joint regional recommendations were intended to help, and the range of other programs that are going on. I think Alex put up a slide at the end of the presentation that will be emailed out to you later that have some resources there.
Thanks. We had a question specific to the City of Meridian example that was mentioned in our pre-webinar announcement. We're working with both, actually, the City of Meridian on a phosphorus feasibility analysis right now, as well as the City of Santa Rosa, who are also looking at ways to generate phosphorus offset credits in their watershed down in Northern California. So really the best place to go, obviously these are public scopes of work, but the best place to go would just be to contact the environmental department of those cities to learn more. They're both excited to be working on this and better understand the opportunity the water quality trading programs could be for them. And so obviously a feasibility analysis is really just at the beginning of seeing if this is going to work, and we're excited to be doing that work. So I can pass you along to the relevant person if somebody would like to email me directly, or I would just follow up with those two cities to hear more about the different analyses that the Freshwater Trust is currently undertaking for those entities. Got another one here. Why was temperature the driver? And if there are temperature exceedance, are actions other than riparian restoration available? Temperature was the driver out here in Oregon. As you may know, we have a lot of salmon that we're very proud of out here in the Pacific Northwest, and so TMDLs for some years now have been incorporating temperature limits into wasteload allocations, and that has led a lot of Pacific Northwest entities to be looking at potential temperature exceedances down the road that could have some impact on salmon spawning or rearing, etc. So that certainly was the earliest driver here in Oregon, and where we looked at the different activities that could reduce the entire temperature profile of a river, especially at the times where it's most necessary for fish. And that was really how riparian restoration became the first action, was because it was highlighted by many stakeholders as one that was most impactful at improving water temperature conditions for salmonid spawning. There is just recently another action in Oregon that generates temperature credits, and that is flow augmentation. There's now the water temperature transactions tool that has been approved by Oregon DEQ for generating temperature credits, and so now there are two actions. When we look at phosphorus, nitrogen, and others, there's probably going to be many, many more actions that can reduce the inputs of those sources. As I said, we're currently generating phosphorus credits from livestock exclusion, but we see huge opportunities for edge of field wetlands, buffer strips, sediment traps, changing in crop types, reducing fertilizer application, upgrading irrigation from flood to center pivot. Many, many different things can reduce sediment inputs and phosphorus inputs into the rivers and streams here in the U.S. I have another question, and then back over to David, on the lifespan of a credit and are credits resold annually. What we're seeing is that certainly for something that needs, as David was saying, for riparian restoration, it really needs 20 years of maintenance and monitoring for everybody to be sure that there is an ecological benefit that is assured. And so that's why an underlying contract of 20 years, minimum of 20 years, is necessary for riparian restoration. When we look into some of those on-farm activities that generate phosphorus credits or nitrogen credits, some of those activities we think of as cultural, where it's a contract with a landowner to, say, use less nitrogen or change what crop types or how they are moving those crop types around on farm. Some of those can only last for 5 years, and that can really increase the uptake of that specific activity, especially because it costs less to implement those practices. But then again, where those practices really are very expensive, such as upgrading 100 acres from flood to center pivot or drip irrigation, that's a very costly measure, and oftentimes it will last for 20 years if it's maintained properly. And so the minimum project life for something like that, which is more of a structural upgrade as opposed to a cultural upgrade, needs to be closer to 20 years. So it's really something that needs to be agreed upon by the stakeholders and the regulators that need to be part of the decision to put a water quality trading program into practice. But those quality standards and really clarity on those quality standards are extremely necessary for a credit generator, a project developer, to be interested in getting involved in this on behalf of a municipality or as a partner to a municipality.
And just to add, I would add to that, Alex, that when we're working with municipalities around the country, it seems like there's a strong preference for a longer credit life. Just it brings more security to the compliance solution when contracts for credits have a longer life. So I'm going to take a couple of questions here. One of the first questions is there a minimum size to make a water quality trading program work? Our experience is no. That the first thing we ask is the water quality trading program better environmentally? If it has a better environmental outcome than the next best technology alternative, regardless of how small, then it ought to be considered. I think that the considerations are really around the investment of time and energy for a water quality trading program compared to the next best technology alternative. And so we haven't come to a case yet where the size of the program is too small to be workable, nor have we seen one that is too big to be workable. We have a couple of questions that I'm going to really related to stacking, and for those of you new to the space, that there's long been a thought that a single action that generates multiple credit values, as discussed, as Alex showed in his slide, something that creates temperature credits also has nutrient benefits, and is it possible to sell the temperature credit and the nutrient benefit off that same action? And I think that this is an ongoing and pretty vigorous policy debate that's happening around the country. No rules have been established on this yet, but I think certainly various parties around the country have made their preferences known. We don't have any examples of where that's happening to date. In Oregon, through the Willamette Partnership Counting on the Environment standards, they have a methodology for map unit accounting, that maximizes choice for the individual land manager to document a range of benefits that occur from a large-scale restoration action, and then by establishing map units within an individual property, a landowner or a project developer can develop and sell different types of credits to different parties, so long as those credits are serialized and those map units are isolated. It really has to do with the transparency of the credit accounting to ensure that no single action is generating credits that are sold to more than one buyer at any one time. But this is an ongoing policy discussion nationwide, and I suspect that in years to come it will sort itself out, but there is no currently standing policy on that. So, Alex?
All right. Well, we are at the end of our webinar. I really appreciate, again, everyone tuning in. Hope that this has proven valuable, and both David and I are excited to have any follow-up conversations that you may wish to have. We see this as a rapidly growing field, and certainly the Freshwater Trust as a conservation organization is very supportive of these types of programs as ways that we can work within current regulatory structures to really maximize the benefit of public dollars spent on the environment. And that's why certainly we're so interested in speaking with anybody and everybody who wants to figure this stuff out. So thanks again for your time. It was great meeting you, I guess, on this webinar. Take care, and hope to hear from you soon. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. That concludes today's webinar. This webinar has been recorded, so a recording will be made available at the end. We will also be emailing the slides. So any of the links that we included, you'll be able to access once we email you a copy of the slides. And finally, as you close out of the webinar, there's a brief survey. So if you have any final questions that you want to ask Alex or David, you can type those into the final survey. Thanks, and have a good day.